Slavery. We often focus on the suffering, the cruelty, and the eventual abolition. We tend to ignore the slaves themselves, as if they were passive. We ask, why didn't people resist? How could they let this continue? The easy answer is that there were laws which upheld the arrangement and systematically held back the enslaved from things that would have empowered them, such as funding and education. But another answer is, people did resist, sometimes successfully, and one of the most effective opponents of slavery in the United States was a certain slave woman called Harriet Tubman. Tubman not only escaped slavery and rescued tens of others, earning herself the nickname Moses in the process, more crucially than that, she led her life with such trailblazing bravery that inspired others to change their mindset from one of victimhood to one of agency and power. I'm Luke Pierce, and this is the Radical History channel, where we explore the heroes, the heroines, and campaigns who won us the rights and freedoms of today. Harriet Tubman was born Araminta Ross in Dorchester County, Maryland, in around 1820. Because her mother was a slave, Minty, as Harriet was known, was legally a slave too. Tubman's life was controlled by the landowner Edward Brodess, who owned about 20 slaves. Her days were filled with plantation work and domestic labour, all without pay. Several of Brodess's slaves took care of his 8 children, and others were regularly hired out to other farmers with larger plantations. Harriet worked up to 6 days per week, dawn until dusk, under the eye of an overseer. Slavery was about more than economic control. As a child, Harriet was hired out to another house to look after one of their children. She was meant to rock the baby while it slept. When the baby woke and cried, Tubman was whipped. She had scars for life. Harriet and her family lived in a small cottage with an earthen floor and basic furniture. Disease and nutritional deficiencies were rife, and there was no proper medical care. Tubman had a life expectancy of about 30 years old. When a supervisor threw a metal weight at another slave who was running away, he missed and hit Minty instead. For the rest of her life, Tubman suffered from dizziness, painful headaches, and episodes of narcolepsy accompanied by vivid dreams, which she believed were visions from God. Tubman's visions led her to reject New Testament teachings urging slaves to be obedient and to adopt the Old Testament's message of deliverance, centered on the story of Moses, who freed the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. The pseudo-scientific literature of the time contains references to Drapetomania, the supposedly irrational desire of African slaves to escape captivity. For anyone suffering from this entirely discredited illness, the odds were stacked against you. In the South, the whole system was designed to keep the enslaved in that position. There were all kinds of laws and practices known as slave codes, designed to limit the rights and freedoms of enslaved people. While a slave owner was allowed to kill a slave, it was illegal for slaves to become educated. Free people who helped or cooperated with escaped slaves could be killed. The only viable route out was to bide one's time until a benevolent master decided to free you, or somehow save enough money to buy your own freedom. But perhaps as a result of her visions, Tubman dared to contemplate the only other available strategy: resistance. Tubman was forcibly separated from her sisters when Brodess sold them to another plantation owner. But when Brodess tried to sell her younger brother, Moses, Tubman's mother hid him. She managed to force Brodess to back down by threatening violence against anyone who came into her house to take her boy. Tubman registered her mother's successful defiance of Brodess. It showed her that it was possible for slaves to stand up to their overlords. When Edward Brodess died in 1849, Tubman feared she'd be sold as part of his estate to settle his debts. Emboldened by the stories of other slaves who'd run away to the northern free states, she plotted her own escape. She first attempted to escape with 2 of her brothers, Ben and Henry. The 3 of them had been hired out to a large plantation in Caroline County. On the 17th of September 1849, they ran away. At first they weren't noticed, and the usual newspaper notice wasn't filed until 2 weeks later. But soon Ben and Henry got cold feet. It's thought that Ben was a new father at the time. The 3 of them decided to return voluntarily. So Harriet, aged about 29, ran away again, this time alone. Tubman made use of a network of abolitionists, Quakers, and free African Americans known as the Underground Railroad, which sheltered escaping slaves and supplied them on their route north. The Underground Railroad was so called because escaped slaves would disappear from view, as if they'd gone underground. Guides who helped escapees navigate territory were known as conductors. The conductors took the fugitives from one station to the next. Stations were typically homes of sympathetic individuals, but included churches and even forests. Those who hid slaves in their homes were known as station masters. Conductors would provide new clothes and footwear to help slaves disguise themselves, along with forged documentation proving free status. Sometimes parts of the journey would be done on actual trains. Tubman moved by night, guided by the North Star, hiding in woods and marshes and pretending to work as a domestic labourer in safe houses along the route. She travelled 100 miles, crossing from Maryland into the free state of Pennsylvania. But the taste of freedom was bittersweet for Tubman. Whilst walking the streets of Philadelphia as a free woman, she knew that her husband, family, and everyone she'd ever met remained back in Maryland. When Tubman heard that her niece, Kessia, and her 2 children were due to be sold at auction, she hatched a plan for Kessia's husband, a free man, to make the winning bid. She arranged for the family to escape to a safe house and then to travel by canoe to Baltimore, where she met them and guided them to Philadelphia. After this success, Tubman returned to Maryland to rescue her brother Moses. When she came for her husband, the free man, John Tubman, she found that he'd remarried in her absence. Unable to return with John, she helped other slaves to escape to Philadelphia instead. And this is how Tubman became part of the Underground Railroad network. Tubman began making regular trips back to Maryland to help fugitive slaves. She rescued about 70 slaves on 13 separate trips, including her own parents and siblings. As well as fleeing slave owners and legal officials, Tubman and her runaways had to avoid the attention of bounty hunters, who were lured by newspaper notices promising cash rewards for the return of fugitives. Tubman's groups would typically set off on a Saturday evening, giving them a head start on newspaper announcements, which weren't published until the Monday morning. It was as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, shepherding fugitive slaves to a life of freedom, that Tubman came to be known as Moses. The activities of the Underground Railroad became even more difficult with the passage of a new law in 1850. The Fugitive Slave Act was passed by the US Congress as part of a compromise between pro- and anti-slavery states. It was motivated by a desire to avoid a crisis that might lead to secession or war. The act required slaves to be returned to their owners, even in states that had outlawed slavery. State and federal legal officials were meant to enforce it by finding, capturing, and trying escaped slaves. Abolitionists nicknamed the law the Bloodhound Bill, after the dogs used to track down escapees. The Fugitive Slave Act made the work of the Underground Railroad even more dangerous, because slave trackers now combed even the so-called free states. Instead of guiding escaped slaves from Maryland to the northern states, Tubman and other conductors had to take them all the way to Ontario in Canada, where the British Empire had abolished slavery. Tubman also had to contend with opposition from within the group she was helping to escape. In the face of psychological terror, fugitive slaves would occasionally change their minds and want to turn back, putting the rest of their group at risk. Tubman said she once held a gun to a man's head and made him choose freedom or death. With Tubman's persuasion, the man eventually made it to Canada. Of her time running these escape routes, Tubman said, "I was conductor of the Underground Railroad for 8 years, and I can say what most conductors can't say. I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger." The 1850 Compromise failed to mask rising tensions between abolitionists in the North and slave owners in the South. John Brown, a Northern abolitionist with deep moral convictions, decided that violence was now necessary. He planned a slave rebellion to begin with a raid on the Federal Armory in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Once the armory was captured, slaves could arm themselves, and the rebellion would then spread across the South and put an end to slavery. Harriet Tubman helped Brown recruit participants for the attack. He did manage to capture the armory, but the hordes of expected slaves didn't rise up. Local militia attacked the armory, then Marines arrived under the command of Robert E. Lee. Brown was taken alive and convicted. Brown became the first person executed for treason in the history of the US. Tubman declared that he'd done more in dying than 100 men would in living. Brown's offensive was a foretaste of what was to come. The tensions erupted into a nationwide civil war in 1861, pitting the anti-slavery Union against a pro-slavery Confederacy. Tubman became a military scout in the Union Army. Building on her Underground Railroad contacts, she organized a network of spies among black men in the South, and she became the first woman to lead an armed expedition in the war. On the 2nd of June 1863, Tubman led a raid of 150 African-American soldiers on Combahee Ferry, South Carolina. The Union troops set fire to plantations and destroyed Confederate supplies. Fittingly, for an operation led by Tubman, 750 slaves were able to board the steamboats and escape. As the war turned in the Union's favour, bondage for the Confederacy's 3.5 million slave population effectively ended in each county as the Union armies arrived. The last Confederate slaves were freed on June the 19th, 1865, which is celebrated as the modern holiday of Juneteenth. After Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the Reconstruction Act of 1867, and the post-war amendments to the US Constitution, all black people in the US were officially free citizens. Although poverty and violence remained the reality for many former slaves, Tubman's rescues and the work of the Underground Railroad came to an end. Aged 45 at the end of the Civil War, you might have thought this would be the moment for Harriet Tubman to hang up her gun and retire.
It's a lifestyle I can certainly recommend.
But during the second half of the 19th century, Tubman instead took on new crusades against poverty and inequality. Despite her own illiteracy, Tubman set up schools to teach African Americans to read and write, and helped establish a home for the elderly. She also threw herself into the cause of women's suffrage, meeting campaigners like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Tubman used her Civil War stories as evidence of women's equality to men. Tubman's campaigning and humanitarian work took their financial toll, and she lived in poverty in her later years. Contemporary biographies led to a campaign to provide her with a military pension. An amount of $20 per month was eventually agreed by Congress for an inspiring veteran of 19th century America's several wars of conscience. And this is why the $20 bill has become the battlefield for the current dispute over Tubman's recognition. Today's disagreements aren't really over the facts of history, but about which bits of the past we're willing to celebrate or confront. For 2 centuries, the choice has been to immortalize presidents and generals, whether in statues or on currency. But true leadership, as Tubman's story shows us, can emerge in all kinds of places. If you enjoyed this video about Harriet Tubman, then you might enjoy this video about another radical heroine from history.